As everyone's coming back on, we're just going to get started with the next presentation. And this is a presentation by Cari, Lynn, Squibb. And the presentation is Lower Colorado River Restoration. Change is good for yellow-billed cuckoos on the Lower Colorado River. Great title. I love it so much.
Lynn Squibb, and I work for Southern Sierra Research Station. And today I will be going over some habitat preferences for yellow-billed cuckoos that we've noticed on the Lower Colorado River through the lens of the LCR MSCP program. This presentation was originally written by Barbara Raulston, but she is currently living her best retiree life. So you're stuck with me instead. So I'll first go over a bit of Lower Colorado River history. Robert Omart and Burton Anderson oversaw extensive bird censusing on the LCR during the 70s and 80s, which culminated in their book, Birds of the Lower Colorado River Valley. They developed this paradigm that mature cottonwood willow stands provide the primary habitat for yellow-billed cuckoos in the LCR. During the 1980s, information on cuckoo habitat was a mixed bag. There was some mention of habitat use other than mature cottonwood willow. Gaines and Lehman in 1984 said that cuckoos were not restricted to old-growth willows and cottonwoods, that they would inhabit young trees as well, and they suggested maintaining habitat through flooding and thinning. And Anderson and Lehman in 1988 said that the average tree height ideal for cuckoos was 10 to 15 meters, and that cuckoos nested in at least 3-year-old habitat. During the 1970s through the 1990s, the main cuckoo population on the LCR was in Bill Williams River National Wildlife Refuge, pictured here. For those that are unfamiliar with the area, the Bill-Will River is a tributary of the Lower Colorado River between Lake Havasu and Parker, Arizona. So large floods during the late 1980s and early 1990s maintained a mosaic of different age stands of cottonwood willow on the Bill-Will. And the cuckoos like that. In 1998, the cuckoo population was estimated at 20 to 25 pairs on the refuge. However, cuckoos have been declining in the LCR for decades due to channelization, dam construction, etc. This is a graph showing detections of cuckoos at the Bill-Will over the past few years. And you can see that the most recent decline began around 2011 on the refuge. There were no surveys conducted in 2016, but in 2017, no cuckoos were detected at all there. In 2018 and 2020, there were a few high flow releases for dam maintenance purposes at Alamo Lake, upstream of the refuge. And due to the increased water, habitat conditions have improved somewhat since then, but not nearly enough to get back to the cuckoo detections that we saw 10 years ago. Meanwhile, the LCR MSCP began creating habitat on the main stem of the LCR. So with the listing of several species as endangered in the 80s and 90s, and with the prospect of more species becoming listed in the future, there was a clear need for a long-term program that would balance the interests of water users with conservation of endangered species. And this prompted the development of the LCR MSCP and a habitat conservation plan for the Lower Colorado River, which was then implemented by the Bureau of Reclamation in 2004. So the plan called for 17 restoration sites between Davis and the U.S.-Mexico border, and this would provide habitat for 28 species covered by the LCR MSCP. And yellow-billed cuckoos are one of the species covered under the program. On the left is a little hatchier cuckoo, still has the dark bill, and on the right is an adult that has been captured for banding purposes, and it's been marked with green ink for short-term ID purposes. So the habitat conservation plan for cuckoos was following the old habitat paradigm that had been created in the 80s and 90s, that cuckoos were associated with these large patches of mature cottonwood willow habitat. But because the program was also trying to provide habitat for these 28 other species, a mosaic of uneven age stands was going to be planted. So the MSCP was finalized in 2004, and Reclamation soon began using mass planting methods to develop cottonwood willow habitat along the LCR, with one of these restoration sites being Palo Verde Ecological Reserve. Beaver was planted with the species listed here, with 414 hectares planted in phases between 2006 and 2013. And annual surveys were conducted throughout each conservation area, most beginning during the second growing season after planting. At all of the sites planted with cottonwood willow, we saw a very positive response from the cuckoos. And they started showing up as soon as 2 years following planting, which was a bit of a surprise to many of those who thought the species preferred a mature gallery cottonwood willow forest. And there was a bit of a management concern that by year 5 after planting, detections begin to decline, with cuckoos moving into more recently planted areas. So by 2015, 96% of the 414 hectares planted at Beaver were occupied by cuckoos, and up to 80 yellow-billed cuckoo breeding territories were estimated. So with these surveys, a new paradigm was formed by McNeil et al. In 2013. They found that native small tree stem density and total canopy closure positively associated with cuckoo nest placement, and native large tree stem density showed a weak positive association with nest placement. Planning at Beaver started in 2006, and cuckoo surveys started in 2008 when there were approximately 75 hectares planted. And as you can see on this graph, cuckoo detections increased as the site grew. Detections leveled off between 2014 and 2016, and then began declining in 2017. And that decline has continued in the past 2 years, with only 92 detected this field season. This is one of Shannon McNeil's slides showing the relationship between patch size and detections. She looked at 3 patch sizes, 20 hectares, 50 hectares, and 80 hectares. So analysis of large patch size versus cuckoo detection shows a strong correlation, but age and size together seems to be the key. At the 20 hectare patch size, there aren't many detections no matter what age the site is, and as the sites increase, the relationship between detections and stand age becomes apparent. So there are more detections in large young stands, but detections decrease in the older stands. And here's a graph just showing detections by stand age at Beaver. Detections are highest 3 to 4 years after planting, and there are just 4 detections in the 13-year-old stand. So cuckoos are showing a preference for the newly planted areas. And here's that same data again on the black line. showing the detections are highest in stand ages 3 to 4. But we've also got 2 other lines on there. The yellow line is survey results from 2019, and the previous slide showed cuckoo detections have declined overall, but cuckoos are still showing a preference for the youngest age classes present, with the highest detections in stand ages 7 through 9. And the green line shows the area of each age class at Beaver in 2019. So most of the hectares, 272 hectares, are within the 7, 8, and 9 age classes in 2019. There are several other sites in various development stages near Beaver, one of them being Sebola National Wildlife Refuge, where this picture was taken a few years ago. And detections at these sites are on the rise, likely due to the new habitat. But because we aren't banding cuckoos anymore, we can't say for sure that the cuckoos from Beaver are moving into new plantings at these other sites. But we are interested to know if anyone else is seeing this pattern of stand age and detections elsewhere. And that is all I have for today. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.
So the next talk is from Kristen G. Dillon, and the talk is entitled Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo Habitat Use on the Middle Rio Grande in New Mexico.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Kristen Dillon. I work for the Bureau of Reclamation Technical Service Center in Denver. And this work was done in collaboration with the Reclamation Albuquerque area office and other project partners here in New Mexico. We monitor the yellow-billed cuckoo population on the Rio Grande from the south boundary of the Isleta Pueblo all the way to El Paso. For today, I'm just going to focus on the middle Rio Grande. Dave is going to be following me after this with information on the lower Rio. But we're just going to focus on this highlighted area from Isleta Pueblo down to Elephant Butte Dam. So if we zoom in on that area, the survey area is divided into 7 river reaches. I just have them color coded here to kind of give you a sense of place. Each of those yellow dots is a cuckoo territory derived from survey detections. We typically document about 100 cuckoo territories per year on the middle Rio Grande. About half of those are in the northern 6 reaches. So this graph on the left just shows you annual territories by river reach. In the middle Rio, we typically have about 10 territories per reach. The other 50% is in the San Marcial reach. So we usually have approximately 50 territories per year concentrated in this southern 20% of the middle Rio Grande. So I'm going to spend this talk kind of discussing the characteristics of occupied habitat on the middle Rio and talking a little bit about why we see this kind of preferential use of habitat and concentration of cuckoo territories in the southern end of the San Marcial Reach. So first of all, if there is one thing that most cuckoo populations have in common, it's that they're most often found in native overstory dominated habitat. And that is certainly true on the Rio. Nearly 3/4 of the overstory vegetation encompassed by cuckoo territories is characterized by native dominated habitat. On the Rio Grande, that is primarily Goodings willow and cottonwood. However, importantly, our analyses have found that native canopy alone is insufficient. Having some understory structure is really quite important for cuckoos on the Rio. We found that native habitat that only has overstory structure without that understory structure only accounts for about 5% of total use. Often the understory structure will be some sort of mix of native and exotic vegetation, often Russian olive or salt cedar, but having that understory structure is important. Additionally, we have found that cuckoos on the Rio Grande exhibit a preference for Gooding's willow habitat over cottonwood habitat. I find this really fascinating. We have done an analysis of cuckoo habitat occupancy versus availability. And we found that Gooding's willow habitat is used at about 4 times its availability on the landscape. So in other words, only about 12% of the total habitat available on the landscape has a Gooding's willow component, but about 48% of cuckoos use that habitat. So cottonwood habitat is also important, and it's used at about twice its availability on the landscape, but not nearly at the same level that Gooding's willow is. Interestingly, cottonwood is actually more abundant on the landscape than Gooding's willow. There's about twice as much cottonwood habitat as there is Gooding's willow habitat, but cuckoos just use Gooding's willow habitat at a much higher rate on the mill Rio. So for these next few slides, I want to look a little bit more closely at some of our radio telemetry data to kind of compare the differences in habitat use between the northern reaches, which I'm using an example of a breeding female in the Escondida reach to represent, and that southern high density habitat, where I'm using here an example of a breeding female in the San Marcial reach to be representative. So please just keep in mind, I am showing you the maps for these 2 specific birds. I'm going to talk about numbers, data that are the averages for the reach as a whole. But I think the maps are really helpful in kind of visualizing the numbers I'm talking about. So just to orient you to the maps quickly, each of those red dots is a telemetry point for the bird. The kind of light green blob is the 95% kernel home range. I'll refer to it as the bird's territory. It includes both nesting and foraging habitat. And then the pinkish blob is the 50% kernel home range. I'll refer to it as the core use area. And this is what we really think of it as the bird's nesting habitat. In fact, in that left-hand map, you can see that yellow star up there. That's where the nest was for that bird. So if we compare area requirements in the Escondida reach versus the San Marcial reach, we found that on average, birds in San Marcial have much larger territories. The average territory size in San Marcial was 60 hectares compared to only 22 hectares in Escondida. And the average core use area in San Marcial was 11 hectares versus only 5 hectares in Escondida. And I think it's important to say here that that difference reflects differences in availability, not differences in preference. There's simply less habitat available in the northern reaches. This is evident, I think, by looking at the aerial imagery on these maps here. If you look at that left-hand map of Escondida, the riparian habitat is much more narrow, it's patchy, it's sparse, and it's constrained to the west, at least, by agricultural fields and residential development. On the other hand, that San Marcial habitat, it's a much broader floodplain. It's not even entirely encompassed to the east by this map. There's much more contiguous riparian vegetation, and the riparian vegetation is bordered by uplands habitat rather than by development. We see similar differences in the vegetation composition between these birds' territories. So all I've done here is overlay the kernel home ranges with our vegetation maps and symbolize the kernel home range by vegetation type. Without getting into the details, if you just look at these 2 maps, you can see a much broader variety of habitat types in the Escondida reach, and that is indicative of a larger non-native component, right? The bright green color in these maps is native dominated overstory, and you can see much more of that in the San Marcial Reach. So indeed, if we compare the averages for the reaches, when we look at just the core use areas, that nesting habitat, which I've outlined here in red on these maps, in Escondida, about 35% of the area encompassed by core use areas has a native dominated overstory, compared to 55% in San Marcial. Only about 10% of core use areas have a Goodings willow component, compared to nearly half of San Marcial core reach area or core use areas. And conversely, there's much more cottonwood in Escondida. So those Escondida core use areas are about 2/3 cottonwood, compared to only about 1/3 cottonwood down San Marcial. Again, this reflects differences in availability, not differences in preference. There's very little Goodings willow habitat in the northern reaches. It's much more cottonwood dominated. So although cuckoos are exhibiting this clear preference for Goodings willow, they can and will use cottonwood habitat when that's all that's available. I think these photos of the nest sites from the two reaches really illustrate well the differences we're talking about. So both of these photos were taken while we were doing veg work at the nest at the end of the summer. And you can see kind of in the lower center of the photo, our veg tape, our measuring tape, right? And so we are standing at the end of the measuring tape and we have it strung out 50 meters from the nest. So if you just look first at the upper left photo, the Escondida nest site, the nest was in that strip of cottonwoods you see in the background. And it's so interesting because that strip of cottonwoods is only about 40 meters wide. It's bordering an agricultural drain. The other side of it that we can't see is pretty much just this open grassy field, and maybe 500 meters out, there's a house and a yard and some agricultural pastures. And then the side of it closer to us looks entirely in every direction other than these cottonwoods themselves, exactly like what you see here in the photo. It's this kind of low, arid, scrubby mix of baccharis and grass and salt cedar. And the cottonwoods are just this long, narrow strip of native dominated habitat that borders the agricultural drain. And by looking at this, you can tell that the birds are really constrained to that strip along the drain. The surrounding habitat is really not suitable or usable habitat for cuckoos. Whereas in San Marcial, again, we're standing at the end of the tape, 50 meters out from the nest. The nest is in that Goodings willow in the background. There is this big open space between where we're standing and the nest, but that open area is flooded. It has kind of younger age class willows in there. You can kind of see by those leaves right in the foreground that we're standing in another Goodings willow. So overall, the surrounding habitat is much better for cuckoos in San Marcial. And so you'd expect to see these larger core use areas, the kind of larger Goodings willow component, kind of more complex riparian habitat. So based on our telemetry data, as well as some additional analyses that we've done with our survey data that I just haven't really had the time to get into today, we kind of came up with a set of ideal minimum breeding habitat requirements for cuckoos on the Middle Rio Grande, based on what we see the birds using. So first of all, native overstory with a understory vegetation component is key. Certainly we have seen some variation in what the cuckoos will use depending on what's available, but having some sort of native overstory component is important. A Goodings willow component is preferred. Again, cuckoos will use that cottonwood dominated habitat if that's all that's available, but they certainly have a strong preference for Giddings willow. And then a patch size greater than 8 hectares and patch width greater than 30 meters. These are minimums. Bigger is certainly better for cuckoos in our study area. We have not seen cuckoo detections in patches more narrow than 30 meters. And truly only about 10% of all detections are in patches 50 meters wide or narrower. They really like something wider, but we know for a fact they can use this narrow habitat. And especially in the northern reaches where habitat's quite limited, they can use smaller patches, but bigger is better. We certainly have documented birds with territories as large as 175 hectares in San Martial. So why are cuckoos found in higher density in the San Martial Reach? Basically because it has all of these items that we've talked about that make for really highly suitable breeding habitat for cuckoos. There's extensive native overstory vegetation structure with a large Giddings willow component. It's a larger, more complex and undisturbed floodplain. As you can see, just by looking at this aerial imagery on the right, there's it's not as linear and kind of hemmed in by development as those northern reaches are. And it's bordered by upland vegetation rather than agricultural or residential development. As you can see, there's miles of desert uplands on either side of the floodplain down in the San Martial Reach, and we just don't see that in the northern reaches. So I think combined, those really make for preferred cuckoo habitat on the Middle Rio. And with that, I think I have a few minutes left that I can take any questions or hear any comments. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, so again, we're just going to hold questions off until the panel discussion in a few minutes. So our next presenter, and he's ready to go, is David Moore. And his presentation or talk is going to be about the Western yellow-billed cuckoo habitat use on the lower Rio Grande. And you are co-hosted and ready to go.
Thanks, Kristen. Let me pull this thing up here. There we are. Okay. Morning, everyone. Thanks for sharing some time with me. As both Kristens mentioned, I am Dave Moore. I'm with the Bureau of Reclamation's Technical Service Center as well. And I'm going to shift gears to the lower Rio Grande and tell you about some of the work we've been doing with cuckoos down there. So for our purposes, the lower Rio Grande spans the Rio Grande floodplain from Elephant Butte Dam clear on down, basically to the international boundary, to American Diversion Dam / El Paso. That's the study reach that we're working in. And things by and large down there look somewhat drastically different than they look in the Middle Rio, at least in terms of the habitat that cuckoos are occupying. And we generally, for our analysis purposes, break things into two different habitat types / locations. The first one is what's present in the Caballo Lake Delta, which looks like this. It's a relatively unconstrained floodplain. It's got plentiful water, good hydrology, native dominated habitat, more or less unmanaged. Obviously there's some management going on pretty much everywhere, but large expanses of natives in a relatively unconstrained floodplain. The other habitat type that we see on the lower Rio is what we get when we move further downstream. And, this is obviously a little more zoomed out than that picture of the Caballo Delta was, but you get the picture. It's a very constrained floodplain, very narrow strips of habitat. Typically, hydrology isn't near as good. Typically, more non-native dominated, typically tamarisk, lots of tamarisk down there. So two pretty drastically different habitat types. We began doing flycatcher surveys in the lower Rio in 2012. And the following year or two, we started picking up cuckoos, almost to our surprise. The stuff in the Caballo Delta wasn't all that surprising, but areas downstream that don't look anything like what our vision of cuckoo habitat was really surprised us to start finding cuckoos. So once the species was listed, we incorporated cuckoos into our survey effort as well. And when we started finding fairly significant numbers of birds, we thought, well, shoot, let's figure out what they're occupying, how much habitat may be available for them down here. So in 2016 and 2018, we undertook a habitat mapping effort. So here are results of our surveys. And in 2017 was the first year that we surveyed all of the reaches within the lower Rio Grande, at least all of what we thought was potentially suitable habitat. And as you can tell, on an annual basis, we've got upwards of 100 detections within the lower Rio. This yellow portion of the bar is the Caballo, more or less represented by the Caballo Reservoir Delta, and it annually makes up probably at least 50% of our detections. When we do our territory breakdown, kind of the post-processing of our survey data, we again see that the territory abundance is dominated by the Caballo reach, but again, a fairly significant number of territories within other reaches of the lower Rio Grande as well. And annually, we've got between 20 and maybe 32 territories. So, nothing compared to the middle Rio, but again, a fairly decent number of birds down there. So when we pile all these detections onto a map, and again, this is the Caballo Reservoir Delta, the best habitat we've got down there. And these are detections between 2019 and 2021. We've got a boatload of birds. They're packed in pretty tightly within all of the, at least all of the decent habitat. A lot of, let me see if I can make this little doodad work. A lot of this stuff in here is, much more open, very little woody vegetation. The birds are all packed into, these big long strips and patches of habitat. So then we take it one step further and show yellow-billed cuckoo territories between 2019 and 2021. And again, a lot of territories packed on in here. And, in some of these areas where we've got really high quality habitat, they really pack in there. And it's pretty hard for you all to see probably, but these little orange symbols are actual cuckoo nests. So not only do we have a good number of cuckoos in the Delta here, but they're actually nesting, and we've documented a few nesting efforts. We don't typically do a whole lot of nest searching just because it takes an inordinate amount of time and effort, and we just really don't have the time for it. So then we move downstream, and this is the hatch reach, or at least part of the hatch reach. And again, a fair number of detections, but this is about a 12-mile stretch of river, whereas that last photo of the Caballo Delta was more or less 3.5 miles. So the density just nowhere near what we see elsewhere. And this is actually one of the more highly occupied stretches outside of the Caballo Delta. So again, these are detections from the past 3 years. And then when we narrow it down to territories, a handful, but not many. But again, you see these little orange markers here, and those are nest locations. So they are nesting within the floodplain in this reach, even given the scarcity of what we consider high quality habitat. So when we started doing our habitat mapping effort, we looked at what these birds were using in the lower Rio, and it wasn't very similar to what they were using in the middle Rio. So we came up with kind of a different habitat classification scheme. And at a minimum, we wanted habitat that was at least 5 meters tall, at least 30 meters wide, and had a 75% canopy closure. We thought they needed a patch size of at least 2 hectares, and that habitat needed to be native dominated or mixed, as long as there was less than 50% tamarisk within that kind of species composition. So we created 6 different habitat classes. Class 0 was obviously 0, nothing, bare dirt, basically. Classes 1 and 2, we considered unsuitable. Classes 3, 4, and 5 were marginally to highly suitable and varied by height, patch width, and patch size. And this chart down here is a breakout of the habitat classes by reach. And as you can see, within the entire lower Rio Grande, our classes 3, 4, and 5 comprised about 225 hectares. So there's not much that we considered suitable habitat in the lower Rio. And not surprisingly, the Caballo Reservoir Delta dominates the highly suitable habitat. Probably 90% of class 4 and 5 combined was in the Caballo Delta. So when we overlay our cuckoo territories onto our habitat maps, we see something like this. And not surprisingly, this giant patch of the best habitat was very heavily occupied. But then we move up here and we see some class 3s and 4s that were occupied as we'd expect, but also some areas that were lesser quality habitat where the birds were located. And at least that's where our territory locations fell out. Then we move downstream, and here's where it's even a little more surprising. And a lot of these polygons are so small that they're hard to see, but very little what we call suitable habitat in these downstream reaches. Yet we've still got cuckoo territories, kind of to our surprise. So when we look at kind of territory numbers and where they fell out within the Caballo Delta, no surprise, most of them were in classes 3, 4, and 5, our suitable habitat classes. And again, this is a little misleading down here because in order to qualify as cottonwood or willow dominant, we wanted at least 90% of the habitat to be composed of those species. So most of our polygons fell out as a mix of native and exotic, primarily tamarisk. So when we look downstream of Caballo or outside of the Caballo Delta, again, as some of those maps have shown, much greater proportion of birds using what we would consider unsuitable habitat. Only a handful of birds overall, really, as far as territories go, but much more even distribution between the different habitat classes outside of the Caballo Delta. So kind of by means of summary, is there habitat preference going on in the lower Rio? And I think, overwhelmingly, yes. Within the Caballo Delta, 53% of mapped habitat was considered suitable, and 74% of the yellow-billed cuckoo territories fell within that suitable habitat. Downstream, again, it's a little more confusing. 12% of the mapped habitat was considered suitable, and 26% of cuckoo territories fell within that suitable habitat. So again, where they can find that suitable habitat, they're using it, but there just isn't very much of it. As an example, 32 territories, including 2 with documented nests, were located within habitat that we deemed unsuitable. So what the heck's going on? I think basically we've created a heck of a lot more questions than we did answers in doing this work. Are cuckoos just that much more flexible than we think, particularly in areas with poorer habitat? If they're using areas of poorer habitat, is it in essence a sink? Are they having very poor, nest success rates? Is productivity down? We just don't know. We don't have the nest data to really analyze. I think, maybe we need to modify our habitat classification system down there a little bit in order to account for some of this variability. Do we want to manage for this lesser quality habitat? I think not. But again, if it might be the low hanging fruit, and if that's all you can do, maybe that's a strategy. And the big question that we will hopefully answer in the next couple of years with some radio telemetry work is, are cuckoos using habitat outside the active floodplain? And I think they must be. There are big pecan orchards down there that provide some, really tall vertical structure. Given there's probably not a whole lot of prey available in those things because they, I think, nuke them with pesticides, but a lot of questions, and hopefully we'll find some answers one of these days. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We are going to pass it. So we have 2 more folks before the panel. Good presentation. You're getting a couple of those. So next up is Patti Wohner, and her presentation is Restoration Guidelines for Western Yellow-billed Cuckoos. And I also have that one in my grasp. So give me 1 second. All right.
Thanks for joining me for this talk on restoration guidelines for Western yellow-billed cuckoos. I am Patti Wohner, and I'm currently at Oregon State University doing a postdoctoral position. Before I move on, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. First and foremost, Steve Lehman collected the data in the 80s and 90s and was kind enough to relive the past with us. You might be wondering why we would dredge up these old data. How it all got started was Jenna, who now works for Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I were working on a restoration design and wanted to base our restoration on science. So we started by analyzing data we already had from the Kern River Valley. Eventually, we teamed up with my graduate advisor, Sandy King from LSU, and Bob Cooper from UGA to help disseminate what we learned about what cuckoos like, at least in the Kern River Valley. I'm not going to dive too much into the methods and statistics here, but you can check them out in our peer-reviewed papers that are both in Restoration Ecology. So we're going to focus on the Kern River Valley in California, where the red star is. The other two major California populations are also labeled in red here. There are other smaller reliable birds in the past few decades. Before I continue, I would like to make a land acknowledgement to the Tabatatabal tribe that occupies the Kern River Valley. The Tabatatabal people suffered great pain during colonialism through what was called the Whisker Plot massacre, where men of the tribe were tricked into having a peaceful discussion and then slaughtered. Today, many of the descendants of these ancestors reside in communities around the lake, Isabella Reservoir, and the South Fork Kern River, and there is a resurrection of culture and language. So we know that cuckoos breed in extensive riparian forests, and in California, primarily willow cottonwood. Like other places in the range, territory sizes are quite large compared to other songbirds, which are often less than a hectare. But cuckoo pairs require about 16 hectares, which, just to put this in perspective, is about 40 football fields. The large territory size obviously adds considerably to the difficulty in managing for cuckoos compared to other songbirds when they require such huge tracts, but so little riparian forest exists and must be managed for other values as well. To counteract the loss of riparian forest and species decline, there was a huge reforestation effort in the 80s and 90s that continues today. This effort took place across the United States, including in areas like the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. Cuckoos do respond positively to new plantings for a while and then start declining, as we learned in Cari Lynn's talk on the LCR, and as we see here in these graphs. In both the Sacramento River Valley and the Kern River Valley, breeding pairs increased following restoration efforts, but even with this increase in habitat, they soon started to decline sharply after they peaked in both places. The lack of long-term response from cuckoos to restoration efforts seems to indicate it is something besides total acres of, or hectares of riparian habitat on the breeding ground that's causing the declines. Listed on this slide are some hypotheses for decline that we came up with. However, one thing that stood out was that science-based management practices had not been sufficiently explored to rule out habitat quality on the breeding grounds as a major contributing factor for decline, especially in California. Shown here is what some of the critical habitat looked like that we are clearing out in order to plant new trees as part of our restoration efforts. So what we wanted to do then was to see if we could determine what constitutes high quality for cuckoos. We used the historical Kern River Valley cuckoo nest and spot mapping data sets collected by Steve from 1987 through 1996 to find out what cuckoos were selecting in restoration and natural sites, and we looked at vegetation characteristics related to nest productivity. We also looked at other priority riparian species, but I don't have a whole lot of time to discuss these much today. Once we found out what constituted high quality in the Kern River Valley in California, we wanted to be able to use these results for new restoration initiatives and land management plans. I'm going to jump right into the results, and again, you can refer to the papers that we published for the methods. First thing we found out from Steve's spot mapping data was that cuckoo densities here in the left plot on the y-axis were related to the amount of vertical structure in the low canopy on the x-axis. And by low canopy, I'm talking 1 to 5 meters above ground. On the plot to the right, we see a non-linear trend of cuckoo densities with tree height, where the highest territory densities were in sites with mean tree height around 8 meters, and then cuckoo densities declined thereafter. It should be noted that cuckoo territory density increased with tree height in restoration sites, which are the black dots, and decreased in natural forests with height, which are the open circles in these plots. Thus, the trends in restoration versus natural forests may follow different trends in what we see here on these plots. They probably don't, but this would be something that would be great to test with longer monitoring programs, like greater than 10 years or so, to confirm cuckoo territory density in order restoration follow the same height trends as in natural forest. An interesting aside is that some of the other riparian species, like song sparrow, common yellowthroat, and yellow warbler territory densities all show relationships with mean tree height, where territory densities increase with height all up to about 6 to 8 meters and then start to decrease thereafter. We see the same trend as in cuckoos, where densities increase in restoration sites with increasing height and then start decreasing in natural sites with decreasing heights. Another thing that we found from looking at the spot mapping data, and this may be obvious, but there is a relationship between how much vertical structure is in the low canopy, that this is on the y-axis, and mean tree height, again on the x-axis. As restoration forests start to have a mean tree height of about 6 meters or so, there are high amounts of vertical structure in the low canopy, and that, again, that's 1 to 5 meters. We only have data from restoration sites up to about 9 meters of height, but data from natural sites with mean tree heights greater than 9 meters show that with increasing tree heights, there is less vertical structure in the low canopy. And this makes sense. Okay, moving on to the nest site selection results. These are the probability of use for nesting cuckoos on the y-axis in relation to 4 vegetation variables from top models from binomial logistic regression on the x-axis. The 5 different blue lines are 5 different natural sites in the Kern River Valley. Cuckoos only nested once in restoration sites in the KRV, even though they were found there during spot mapping and their territories overlapped restoration areas. And this highlights that cuckoos can use lower density restoration areas, but seem to need higher density areas like those found in natural areas for nesting sites within the larger riparian forest. And this is supported by the 4 plots here. The probability of a cuckoo nesting in a site increased rapidly with canopy cover. And this is on the top left plot. Was beyond 75% in a 5-meter radius. So a 5-meter radius is about 80 meters squared, which is a fairly small patch about the size of a mature tree. So we need to provide nesting patches with high canopy cover in our restoration designs. The probability of a cuckoo nesting in a site approached 50% when the DBH goes below 25 centimeters DBH, which is about the size of my hand, like from the thumb to my finger. That's about 17 centimeters, and the size of my husband's hand is about 25 centimeters. So they're pretty small trees. And this agrees with data from another recently published study on nest site selection on the lower Colorado River, which was presented by Jenna. Cuckoos always selected nest sites with more willow than what was available in all 5 of the KRV sites. So we'd want to plant mostly willow according to this analysis. Cuckoos also selected sites with more forb cover than what was available, which may have to do with insect preferences for vegetation of younger leaves. And they also tend to like the younger vegetation of willow leaves, that's the insects. Not shown here, but we also saw that the number of young fledged per nest increased with increasing percent willow in nest sites. So this is another interesting plot. This is a box and whisker plot, and it's showing vertical structure in the canopy at one meter intervals, and those are along the x-axis. And it's comparing used plots, which are the let's see, they're the darker bars, compared to the availability plots, which are these lower, whiter bars in the South Fork Wildlife Area and the Cari. So cuckoos were selecting plots with almost twice the vertical structure compared to what was available at every 1 meter interval in the canopy, except from 0 to 1 meters and 14 to 15 meters. So since cuckoos select nest locations with dense structure throughout the entire canopy, we want to make sure that we encourage this type of structure in a restoration design. So our research indicates that a lack of vertical structure in the low canopy and perhaps even in the mid canopy and at lower tree heights provided by young forest indicated by smaller DBH trees cannot be excluded as a viable hypothesis for recent cuckoo declines, despite the apparent availability of potential riparian habitat. It may be that older forests with a lack of low canopy vertical structure is low quality habitat, and we need to look beyond just a number of hectares of riparian forest that's available. You can see here in these photos a difference between the top photos with no lower vertical structure and the young dense forest in the bottom panels. Again, our results indicate that cuckoos need patches of dense riparian forests, at least for nesting. We could do management via an experiment and then see what works and adapt in the next iteration of management, say on a 10-year cycle. We encourage removing patches of mature canopy via natural river flows because the natural river flows might promote natural regeneration, which is more economically feasible than some of our planning procedures and would produce much higher densities of riparian regeneration. Some areas might not be amenable to natural flooding, and high-density plantings combined with irrigation at sites that are easy to irrigate may be necessary. Planting at high density has been successfully done at the Palo Verde Ecological Reserve, which currently has the largest population of breeding cuckoos on the LCR and in California. These two photos are of natural regeneration on the left that came in with natural flooding, and a high-density planting on the right where water can be controlled via an irrigation ditch. You can see that the natural regeneration, which establishes on its own with flooding, has much higher densities than the plantings on the right, and therefore require fewer resources, aside from a reliable source of water for about 4 years until taproots of the saplings reach the water table. The conditions for seedling establishment are naturally so restrictive that decades might pass without effective large-scale regeneration events, especially in upland restoration sites. So mature forests might need to be re-entered to create high-quality nesting habitat. In many situations, it will not be possible to re-establish forests large enough to remove mature trees from the canopy, and cutting trees might be necessary. As willow cottonwood has no value, we would need to find ways of clearing it, like using excavation mulcher, as seen in the left photo here. Any ideas on what to do with these trees are welcome. We could start by re-entering mature forests and creating small patches of perhaps one tree up to about 4.5 hectares. Currently, we don't actually know what the size of high tree density patches are that could benefit cuckoos. Water is not easily managed and manipulated in the West due to water rights, drought conditions, negative perceptions, etc. So re-entering riparian forests should be prioritized based on where you can bring water reliably. I call this low-hanging fruit. For instance, here on the right is a patch that is next to an irrigation ditch that gets water in the spring when riparian trees are dispersing seed. This irrigation could augment the plantings that are already in a patch by promoting natural seedling establishment under an already mature canopy. We could also cut patches of mature trees and mechanically clear the ground vegetation to expose bare soil to promote germination of seedlings. To always have young forests on the landscape, we might need to re-enter patches of mature forests on a regular basis, as I said before. While rotating forests on a 10-year schedule could seem daunting, cuckoos may only require a small proportion of the breeding territory to be early successional for nesting. I'm going to try to show here what I'm talking about using the Beale Lake restoration site as an example. This is a photo from several years ago when they had just planted the units in here. So let's say this is a site that we wish to manage a few patches for young forest so that there's always young forest for nesting. And let's say that the outside tracks are the easiest to get the water to, as illustrated by the blue bars that I've drawn around the units here. And I'm actually not sure where the irrigation canals are in this unit. I just made this up for the purposes of explaining the restoration that I'm thinking of. So let's also say that we don't have enough water to irrigate the entire unit. So we have the center, we leave that center in mature forest and let it grow older and say get to the old growth stage. We can do experiments here within each tract whereby we try different sizes of patches. So there's actually 21 units here, and let's say that 2 units get a patch treatment every 5 years, so about 10 to 20% of the area will always have 0 to 10-year-old patches, so the young habitat. Again, this is an idea that needs to be experimentally tested. These are just ideas, and I look forward to talking about them later in the next few days. So in the next slide, I'll show what it would look like if we started the experiment in 2025. So where we can get water to, we have harvests of different size patches, maybe like 1/4 of a hectare up to 4.5 hectares, up to perhaps even clearing the entire unit. The patches that we initially cut grow back in 10 years, all while providing high quality nesting habitat for cuckoos and other species requiring young forests for nesting. We could start the whole rotation again in 2055, back in the original 30-year-old stand that we harvested in 2025. So that would be now 30 years old. This is just an example I'm using here to generate ideas and not necessarily what I recommend for Beale Lake, although I would discuss that if anyone is interested. But the idea here is that you always have some young forest while the majority remains in older forest. Thanks for listening. Let's talk about mature forest.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Patti. So next up, we have Nick Bailey, and he'll be giving a talk about identifying and restoring vital fueling stops for globe-trotting cuckoos, tales from South America. And Nick, you should be good to go.
Okay, so good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation today and to have the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing primarily in Colombia, which is what I'll mostly be talking about today. So I just want to begin by reminding us all just how critical migration is in the annual life cycle of many birds. We know for a wide range of species that mortality during migration can be around 60, 70%. And therefore, ensuring that birds find the conditions they need on migration can obviously be part of any strategy to recover populations. And for a successful migration, we also know that energy is key to success. If a bird is going to fly thousands of miles, kilometers, they need to have a lot of fuel on board. So if we can identify these areas where birds get that energy, where they're finding the fuel reserves they need for migration, then we can be one step closer to ensuring that these key links in the annual cycle are protected in the future. So with that little brief introduction to what I'll mostly be talking about, which is going to be migration and stopover sites, I just want to give a very brief overview of what we think we know about yellow-billed cuckoos in the near-tropical region. So there's some certain talks coming later today with some fantastic tracking results that will fill in some of the blanks on this map. But I just wanted to use this by way of an introduction. This map was put together by Ken Rosenberg using a whole bunch of records that he found in different databases. And it gives the general picture that yellow-billed cuckoos are primarily wintering in South America, south of the Amazon basin, so in countries like Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay. And during migration, they generally appear to be overflying most of the Amazon, and there's quite a concentration of records throughout northwestern South America and Central America. But we really don't have a handle on what birds are doing in this area, which would appear to be one of the key halfway points, let's say, in their migratory journey from north to south or south to north. So to that end, this is something we've been trying to answer from the Neotropical Flyways project. The Neotropical Flyways project has been working for the last 4 or 5 years to really understand how South American wintering birds like yellow-billed cuckoos are using this region in northwestern South America, primarily located in Colombia, and the Central American landmass or corridor. And so what you're seeing on this map is all the different study sites where we've worked, and we've undertaken a series of stratified, standardized occupancy surveys to better understand how birds are using these areas during both fall and spring migration. And what's really interesting when you just look at the raw data for yellow-billed cuckoos is that despite the general record suggesting that birds are throughout Central America, what we actually find is much higher concentrations of birds at the study sites in northern Colombia, where we have 96% of the records, and some sites with well over 100 records during migration, whereas in Central America, just 4% of the records. And really very few birds, despite historical records suggesting that birds are using this region. And what's particularly interesting when we look at this is most of the records for Colombia are coming from these areas that in this map are colored in yellow colors, which are essentially much drier parts of the region where we find tropical dry forest and other similar habitats. Actually, when we crunch these data through an occupancy model, specifically for northern Colombia, this is what we get. So here what you're seeing is what we're essentially being predicted as high occupancy areas during spring migration. We're focusing on spring migration here, along the Caribbean coast. So the areas in red, orange, and yellow here are where you'd expect to find the highest abundances of yellow-billed cuckoos. And these overlap almost 100% with what is typically known as a tropical dry forest ecosystem. So having got this far, we felt we really need to understand what these birds are actually doing in northern Colombia, and specifically in these dry forest habitats. So to that end, we set up a spring stopover study, and we worked in a cattle farm called Fincas Las Palmeras that had some remnants of tropical dry forest. And in 2017, we managed to capture 33 yellow-billed cuckoos, 2018, 50. And one thing I just wanted to very briefly mention here is that as you know, none of these birds were in breeding condition, we couldn't actually assign many of them to a subspecies because we don't know what sex they were. However, for those around 35% of birds that could be assigned, actually 8.5% of birds in total were of the Western subspecies. So we have a site here where perhaps somewhere around 20 to 30%, if we could actually assign all the birds, are Western, and the other 70% Eastern birds. That's actually probably quite high given the relative population size of the two subspecies. So what else did we learn during this study? Well, ideally, we would have captured and recaptured birds to look at stopover duration and gains in fuel, but actually capturing cuckoos is difficult, as I'm sure many of us know. Recapturing them is even more difficult. So we relied on telemetry and the MOTUS technology to get a handle on just how long birds were actually spending at this study site. And of 25 birds fitted with MOTUS tags, we got an average stopover duration of 4.5 days. It was slightly longer in the first year, around 6.5 days. There was actually quite a lot of variation between individuals. So some individuals just 1 day, detected at our automated station, you can see mounted on top of the roof of the farm there, and some individuals staying up to 15 days. So presumably there's much longer staying birds were actually fueling up for the next leg of migration, whereas these birds that were stopping for just 1 day, perhaps they made landscape level movements to other areas, or perhaps they'd already fueled up further south and were just continuing their journey. as I said, it was nigh on impossible actually recapturing these birds. It was very difficult to see to what extent fuel reserves were increasing during these stopovers. However, what is interesting is we did catch a number of birds with relatively high body masses. And when you actually compare them to the community of migratory birds within this region, calculate flight ranges based on expected fuel loads, we found that yellow-billed cuckoos had one of the highest potential flight ranges of any of the species studied using this region. And it suggests that they can actually just make a straight jump from Colombia right up to the Gulf Coast without any real need to stop. And that perhaps explains why our occupancy surveys throughout much of Central America don't reveal many birds in this region, or certainly not stopping over for any period of time. Something else we were able to look at, which is obviously key to understanding, what these birds are using to fuel up in this region, was diet. So through foraging observations, we were able to understand that the majority of prey items were caterpillars, and perhaps no great surprise, with just some birds apparently eating other smaller insects, fruit, or occasionally eating leaves or flowers or something similar. So at this stage, some of you may be asking, why tropical dry forest? Given the huge areas of moist forest with apparently high resource levels available throughout northern Colombia, also in lower Central America, why are these birds keying in on this tropical dry forest habitat? And the answer to this question seems to be that the timing of migration in yellow-billed cuckoos, they start arriving in this region from early April through to some kind of mid to late May, is exactly coincides with the start of the rainy season in this ecosystem. And as you can see from these images that are flicking through here, there is a phenomenal transformation of that ecosystem with the rain. So it goes from what almost looks like a desert to this lush green habitat with the arrival of those rains. And clearly with that, you get a huge flush of resources. And that's what we believe the cuckoos are keying in on. And perhaps also explains why they're not using so many areas in Central America, because in many of those Pacific dry forests along the Pacific coast of Central America, the rainy season arrives later. Whereas in Colombia, it's just perfectly timed with the migration of many of these cuckoos through the region. There's a problem, however. So if you just dial back to that first, or the occupancy map where we had these bright yellow and red areas along the Caribbean coast of Colombia. Those areas have been heavily deforested. So what you're seeing here in green is the areas where there are remaining forest, and increasingly yellow is where there's almost no trees left. And that pretty much in north and northwestern Colombia overlaps entirely with the area that yellow-billed cuckoos are using on their spring migration. So we're looking at about a 92% habitat loss, and birds are just relying on very small fragments or remnants of tropical dry forest and isolated trees within cattle pastures or live fences. So given this, we consider it was necessary to start to think about how can we restore this habitat. Obviously, we don't know whether this is limiting, but certainly having more of this habitat within the region is going to help not only yellow-billed cuckoos during their migratory journeys, but a bunch of other species that are also keying in on these dry forest habitats during spring migration. So by undertaking foraging observations on different trees, we began to get a handle on which tree species yellow-billed cuckoos are using more than others, and also which are actually providing higher foraging rates. And what's interesting is that a number of the tree species we identified here, such as Caña fistula, which is Cassia grandis, the Fabaceae species, these are all nitrogen-fixing leguminous trees. So actually there's a real interesting opportunity here where we can plant trees for cuckoos and other migratory birds that are going to provide food, but also these trees are going to be useful for land restoration exercises where heavily degraded land, you can return it to being more fertile over time. And so with that in mind, over the last 2 years, we have established 3 tree nurseries in northern Colombia with support from the Canada Nature Fund. 2 of these are in areas for cuckoos, 1 during spring migration and 1 during fall migration. And we're really trying to enrich these areas by planting trees that we know provide food for cuckoos and other migrants. So far, we have 12,000 trees in the ground, and there's a couple thousand more to go in this year. However, this is just a drop in the ocean when you see the devastation of the tropical dry forests in northern Colombia. And so we really need to find ways to scale this up, to involve many more landowners, and really promote the benefits of this restoration work in terms of increasing soil fertility and also in terms of water resources, which is an increasingly finite and an important resource in this region. And so with that, I will finish. I can't possibly thank everybody who's been involved in the Near Tropical Flyways project and all this work with the Cuckoos, but there's a list of people there, and I'll leave that up just for a couple of seconds so you can skim over it.